Ah, donc, je vais parler en anglais. Je suis désolé pour ça. So the title of my lecture is Beyond Repair, a typical English title that means many things at once. Okay with English? Perfect, thank you. So I'd like to start by reading you something. The existing is the city. It is stronger than anything anyone can invent instead of it. Instead of building a planned world, we find a huge mass that we can only change, alienate, reinterpret, perhaps control by adding little things. This is a quotation from Hermann Czech from his text Der Umbau from 1989. It reminds us, I think, that there is always a past on which we continue to build upon. And I find it useful to place this quotation within the theme that the studio is investigating of transformation, rehabilitation, extension, renovation, conservation of existing heritage, etc. But to place this theme within the context of the city, which is constantly evolving. Another reference I want to place into this conversation is an example. This is Robin Hood Gardens, a building by Alison and Peter Smithson, designed and built between 66 and 72. And it has created a lot of controversy because it's being demolished, as you can see. In fact, one of the two wings, the West Block, has now been completely demolished. And the Victoria and Albert Museum have acquired a part of the building, which they salvaged back in 2017. They salvaged it to keep, in their words, social values. Alive. And I think it's a reminder of the political dimension and the power of development within the debate on reuse. The huge, the large force of finance and economy under the argument of fit for purpose, what people want, is an important context also for you as young architects to place alongside your, let's say, idealistic ambitions of reuse. This is a lecture about our work. So in our very early projects, they were generally remodelings, small scale, small budget, and they were based upon ideas. A studio building in Clerkenwell, heavily influenced by the work of certain artists from the 60s, like Gordon Matta Clark and Dan Graham, led to a sort of physical insertion into an existing building. A building that, or a project that kept as much as it possibly could, like this staircase, which was very tight and moved through the building. If you replaced the stair, it would need twice the area to meet the codes. And it's a project that we drew at 1-to-1 scale to establish the relationships that needed to be very fine between the existing and the new. It was an architecture that we placed that had a resonance with low-cost developer changes to existing buildings. You know, it was very much an observation about what's usually done it related in our minds to the way that ordinary things acquire a significance. If you reframe very ordinary things, something happens, something energetic happens. It was also a project which was about the city, because this is a site that is sitting on a high street in Clerkenwell, but by lighting the ceiling in a certain way in the direction of the plot, you can see from the street that the plot is at an extreme angle from the street itself. In other words, the interior describes the consequence of the urban block being quite distorted. And we, in the interior, a mixture of glass and mirror with these lights create a kind of very complex upper level with a very concentrated lower level. Views of the street, views of the outside are mixed with views back into the space. Becomes a kind of very complex place in a very small project. So back in 1997, when that project was made, reuse wasn't really a word, an expression that we knew. The environment was the attitude to the environment was a inbuilt feeling of how to work responsibly. Not like today, where it's an obsession. And the term adaptive reuse, this is a word that maybe you're not familiar with, but in the UK and America, this is a big word, a big expression, sorry. Adaptive reuse, it emerged actually in the 70s as a real estate shorthand to indicate the modification of an existing structure to achieve maximum or maximal use and economic returns. And slowly it's found its way into the language of architecture in these recent years. It has no theoretical or conceptual heft, or weight, because it seems to say something, but it can be anything. It's a broad brush strategy that's become the mantra of developers, of institutions, and the media. Their response to the climate emergency, sound bites, simple. But while it advocates optimizing what we have, good, it doesn't provide a coherent framework to operate in. And so, like so many statements of intent within the environmental debate, it oversimplifies issues, and its assumptions need to be rigorously examined. In other words, it's no use you saying to your teachers, oh, this is about reuse. So what does that mean? We need as architects to define a conceptual frame in which to understand what your reuse project really is. And historically, approaches to reuse or transformation or restoration, Umbau, let's say, have reflected wider ideological attitudes. I personally think it's really important to understand origins, the origins of things as an architect, because I find it helps me understand my position within a cultural debate. Not just about the local argument, but to understand that we are part of a big continuity of cultural ideas. And in the 1850s, John Ruskin advocated conservative restoration. He was ideologically opposed to reconstruction. He believed that protection was a better strategy. Ruskin defended the aesthetics of the ruin, the patina of weathering and collapse. He saw restoration as a destructive force that effaces the sublime effects of time. It's a position that relates very strongly to the picturesque. The picturesque I have in my bones, you know, because of my Anglo-Saxon heritage. This is a painting by J.M. Gandhi of John Soane's Bank of England. John Soane was the third architect who, over a period of nearly 30 years, added and adjusted this huge urban project in the middle of the city. But he enjoyed presenting this institution of power as a ruin. I think, you know, I have this instinctive affinity towards the picturesque because I'm really, you know, I'm from London, and London is a city that is really fundamentally rooted within ideas of the picturesque and also conversely the mercantile. There's this interaction between the formal and the informal, and the attention paid to a sensorial experience, rationalism. You know, the picturesque movement, by the way, emerged out of as a reaction to French rationalism. The sort of empirical absolute truth of French rationalism was sort of, as always in the history of architecture, you know, someone says this and 10 years later someone says the opposite. And picturesque was presented as another way of seeing the world, which was in a rather more naturalized, albeit composed, naturalized way. But continuing with this sort of historical step by step, around the same time, of course, the famous kind of argument or debate with John Ruskin was with Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, who championed creative restoration. This was a way of re-establishing a building's finished state, whether it had ever actually existed at all. The addition of new layers was allowed in his doctrine, as long as they were an expression of their own time. So in the many projects he made, restoring churches, he advocated that, you know, it was important to express the new work as some kind of representation of the moment it was designed. I think it was interesting with Viollet-le-Duc that he recognized the temporal chain in which architects operate. In other words, working with existing buildings is not static. You need to understand that buildings have many, many lives. I think Ledoux understood that, as he describes in his essay, Entretien, from 1863, the architect begins what others will finish, or finishes what others have begun. The post-war interest in reconstruction, so that's the third thing, reconstruction, was an explicit attempt to win the past back after the devastation of the First World War. It was often reimagining the origin of a building as an idealized monument fixed in time. This is the Cloth Hall in Ypres, and from 1919, you know, this is a Gothic building, rebuilt and indeed in some cases moved to reframe a past. And we may laugh, but this was done in a passionate way. You know, cities, whole cities had been absolutely destroyed. What do you do? What do you do? And the reconstruction view was very powerfully emotive. It wasn't about forgetting what happened, but it was about sort of re-establishing a cultural base that had been taken from so many communities. Hans Dolgast's interpretive reconstruction proposed a subtler approach. These are drawings of my students actually, but this is the Munich's Alte Pinakothek, a building that I'm sure you know, and if you don't, you should. Originally designed by Leo von Klenze, a big architect in the 19th century who built so much of Munich. The gallery, it was a museum, of course, was partially destroyed in the war, and Dolgast was commissioned to reconfigure and to, in a way, repurpose the building. He attempted to make the history of the building visible. The gaps in the ruins are filled in with a stripped down form of construction that maintains the structure and proportions of the original, but uses bricks from rubble of destroyed buildings. So the result combines the history of the building and the scars of its devastation in a, I would say, uplifting narrative of rebirth. This is before and this is after. Germany had almost no economy after the war. So this is the best that you can do, reusing bricks, using steel pipes for columns, establishing, you could say, the best possible relationship between a grand, noble classical architecture and where the German economy was then. In some ways, I find it intriguing that, is it romantic or is it just matter of fact? But interesting with Dolgast is that his idea of interpretive reconstruction included significant change. For example, these two staircases that you probably know, he installed in the late 50s. It changed completely the organization of the building and its orientation, how you move through it. So there's a radical change to the project. And yet, within the city, the building seems to be a kind of the figure that is known, that was known. So the project somehow becomes a memorial to destruction, or rather, it's both that and it's a historical reproduction in a certain way. But he protects and makes sense of all the layers of the building's life. And as a result, a new building emerges from the remains of the old. The old that includes its history. So the building stands as a sort of witness to all its past, whatever has survived. And in 1964, the Venice Charter was another, let's say, diktat, another doctrine. It attempted to bring a modernist order to restoration. It posited a clear definition between what was repaired and what was formerly existed. You can see he's already borrowing ideas from Viollet-le-Duc. And it was an attempt to provide an international framework for the conservation and restoration of historic buildings. I find it so interesting how much history, how much theory seems to be brought back to stabilizing a story of modernism. Because maybe you don't even realize it, but you're being taught a modernist thinking. Hopefully a few of your teachers are encouraging you to think beyond that, but it's pretty likely that you're just stuck in modernist thinking, like all of us were, and all of us need to begin to broaden our horizon, I think. With that power of modernism and the Venice Charter and everything else, the pre-modern, the 19th century, in which there was a real attempt to bring together the old and the new, a great level of invention is written out of modernist history. And then we can thank Aldo Rossi, his old new ideas from the early 70s, in which the modernist view was challenged. This decision to sever links with the past. He defended the strength of collective memory and a sense of belonging by working with types and known forms. This picture, by the way, is by Thomas Struth, a very beautiful photograph. I have to say, I use it a lot in lectures, as does my partner. It describes so powerfully the role a building can play in the city. And none of us care what happens inside the building. Many, many things. It's built for an unknown future, in my opinion. So relevant, I think, to the debate now. But Rossi's anti-modernist position was developed further in the 1980s by Miroslav Schick and other advocates of analog architecture at ETH in Zurich. They embraced the poetry of the everyday, ideas of continuity over reconstruction. They celebrated what is already there in all its imperfection. And I think all of these approaches emerged from a very specific socio-political context. They attempted to articulate a framework for action. Usually they were presented as a worthier alternative to a previous position. And some offered poetic answers, others empirical truths, but all were put forward as mutually exclusive approaches to the need to restructure the existing and give it cultural meaning. So you do this or you do this. What's your position? Just because I like it, because in a way it's an extra reference, but the Glyptothek in Munich, a project by Joseph Wiedemann, who was employed from 1967 to 72, again to repair another building by Leo von Klenze. You can see the square building on the plan there in Königsplatz. A building that followed the tradition in the 19th century of the interiors providing a very important and visible context for works of art. And this building is for the work, the Roman works of art, so sculpture mainly. And as you can see on the right-hand side, the building is full of polychromy. You know, it's heavily decorated and painted with references to Greek and Roman architecture and Roman ideas. And into that setting, you place the sculpture. The building was badly burned and set on fire in the war and left empty for many years. Joseph Wiedemann, with almost no budget, removed what was left of the plaster to reveal a brick shell, which you can see on the left, which he then covered in a wash that set a new context, a new frame for the existing works of art. In our practice, we like to work in a more intuitive and inclusive way, where all of those above doctrines, all those ideas are relevant and useful. We like and feel comfortable combining and mixing new and old and allowing them to blur into one another. And that means that we have to understand our position in relation to a historical context. And continuity is really the key word for us. It's a recognition of many layers of history and construction, the new and the old, the nearly new and the nearly old, the very old, and even the not very good are regarded as broadly equivalent. And this is a deeply subjective attitude which expresses an openness to the complexities of the project. And it's a broadening of the idea of authenticity. What is authentic? It's a recognition that there is more to a building than its material components, that it is part of a narrative and has a place in the cultural memory of those who inhabit the city. In other words, we develop a specific idea for a specific project, but we try to do that knowingly, that we understand how we are adopting ideas of transformation. And a few small examples. This is a competition we made in 2005. Came second. I still wish that we'd won this project. It's for the Red Star Line, which is an important emigration center in Antwerp, in which household people from Central Europe would arrive in Antwerp and would take the boat that from this very key here where the red paint is, to America. And it was a really appalling situation because they were assessed in Antwerp if they were healthy enough. Because after the first emigres went to America, the Americans often stopped the access if the people coming were not, say, in a good health or had problems. And so the Red Star Line had to ship them back, and it cost them money. And he said, we don't like that, so we'll assess them in Antwerp. And this meant quite horrific. You know, you think it's bad right now with immigration. Go back to the 19th century, even worse. But anyway, they were assessed, they were deloused, their clothes were taken from them, their luggage was taken from them, they were medically assessed. And then the decision was made who would go and who would stay. And often families were completely split because the healthy members of the family would go, the more fragile would stay. And it was a destructive thing. The Red Star Line were a set of buildings that the competition asked us to, in a way, develop a cultural idea for very open brief. They had no idea what to do. 3 buildings you can see on the left-hand side. But in the foreground, you see a shed. But in fact, this is a shed in concrete. But the shed was all buildings were listed, they were protected. But this building was literally falling down. You know, there was rain and air running through. And our idea to restore the project was to cast the existing building against concrete and then dismantle the existing building. So on the right-hand side, you see the facade, where, of course, it's a very strong influence of Rachel Whiteread's work. And on the interior, on the right-hand side, you see the interior of that space. The old chimney became a light well. This became a kind of social space. It was exploring the idea of casting at every level. So casting a building, but also casting furniture. This is a space that had to be, let's say, a permanent memorial to the past, but also a space for appropriation of events and performances and things like this. I won't talk in great detail, but to point out that from our point of view, everything that we added would be a cast. And so that meant the building scale, but it also meant the level of infrastructural furniture. So for example, on the left-hand side, you see a concrete cast bench that was both reminding the visitor of this sequence of events that the emigres would have to go through the process of being checked, but on the other hand became a kind of background to a number of new uses. Another project in 2002 was the renovation of the Upper Lawn Pavilion, a weekend house of Alison and Peter Smithson. Very important project to us and to many others, it seems. But there, when tasked with how to restore the building, we had to dismantle the building piece by piece and then remake it. And from early conversations about adding double glazing and replacing materials, came a project that did none of those things, but literally took things down, cleaned, removed the elements that had been added over years by other owners, replacing the glass with single glass but higher energy efficiency, integrating heating in the floor that you couldn't see. In other words, we tried to make it, or we did make it more comfortable, but our work was completely invisible. But what I find interesting about the project is that, I hear the sketches, how much we learned by dismantling a building. For example, we learned on the right-hand side, when we started to draw the doors and started to take them apart, we noticed that the doors are very conceptually considered. So unlike a standard door that would have a solid frame with a rebate, the whole door is made of 2 planes, and one plane is just shifted from the other to create that stop. You know, it's nothing to do with old craft. It's to do with modernistic ideas, contemporary ideas of how to put things together. very interesting and exciting, many things that we learned on this project. But when it came to the decisions about what goes and what stays, I revisited the building recently, and I was given access through the drawing matter, drawing archive, of all the drawings that were made for this project. And it reminded me that we made decisions about what we kept and what we didn't, and how we organized things in a way that was a sort of fiction. You know, we chose a sort of time of the life of the building that we converted it back to, but then we changed a few things here and changed a few things there. In other words, we invented a completely new narrative for the project. Not so like consciously, but instinctively. We had to add new furniture that was made in tri-board, sort of strong plywood, that reflected something of the old, but was constantly adjusting itself to its new use. And then we made this table that was a real representation of a social space that was a very important part of the daily life of the building. I want to show 4 projects. And in the background, I want just to say that if you're willing to listen, buildings will whisper things to you. Everything okay so far? Good. The first of these 4 projects, I'm going to show 2, say, smallish projects, 2 bigger projects, because I think this theme of transformation has a very strong connection to scale. This is the City Library in Blankenberge, in Flanders. It was actually the first project that we were successful in competition in Belgium. It was the beginning of a very beautiful relationship, which continues today. The City Library existed by the railway station, and there was an old school building that was much loved. Blankenberge had a very unfortunate relationship to Ostend, because Ostend was heavily bombed in the war. And when the German bombers, and indeed the English bombers, dropped bombs, and when they wanted to get home and fly fast, if they hadn't dropped all their load, as they turned to head back, they dropped the rest of their bombs just so they could fly faster. And a lot of them landed in Blankenberge. So poor old Blankenberge, which is a very sort of sleepy seaside town, got absolutely destroyed in the war. Really sad story, but by the way, just another reality that no one ever talks about. The consequence is that there were fragments left in the city, and this building, which was a well-loved school, its noble facade, which was heavily protected, remained, but the buildings either side of it in the street were destroyed, and the space behind was removed completely by bomb damage. You can see this is the railway station, and this is the sea, and this is the main road, the main sort of street that runs to the seaside. So it has a sort of important place. And we were tasked with converting the school building to the city library that was relocating from the railway station location here to, oops, I don't know what I did then, to this existing building. Cool. It's frozen. I'm not very technically skilled, by the way. Help. Bye. See. Anyone with any clever? It's not a Mac, so I really don't know. It's like a foreign language to me. Do you know how to? What did you do? It's so easy, always. The answer's always there. So you see the facade, the rest of the building was heavily destroyed. There was a car park that was added in the 70s behind the building. And in the competition of 4 offices, every office, apart from ourselves, kept the facade, which had to be kept, but removed the structure of the building and built a new building behind the facade. We were instead much more interested in the existing structure, which was a set of large, noble rooms connected room to room. But we needed to repair, of course, the back of the building, and which is this one. And so we added a facade, which was 1.5 meters wide. A new facade, behind which was the circulation of gently sloping ramps. What this did was it allowed us to keep the enfilade plan, but allow for exit of fire and all the exits that you need, the fire routes intact. So there are no corridors, there are no fire lobbies. Everything is dealt with by this inhabited facade. The consequence is the character of the existing rooms was retained. And the facade on the back face is very tight because we only had a certain amount of space, which was in fact 1.65 or something meters. And so the facade had to be very, very tight, everything close together. So you can see already on this drawing, or this photograph, that the reveals are very small. Here is the plan. You can see at the back the ramps that link and connect these three important, the central lobby and then these two cores. And on either side, you see that we added two buildings that have the scale of the street side, that they are they create the two heads of the circulation space at the back. Oh, done it again. So on the left-hand side, you have a very compressed facade, and on the street face, facing the city, those same elements are just pulled apart to give greater depth. So it's the same components, but the spacing is a bit different. I thought there was a section. Oh, can you see that? Yeah. There you can see on the right is the back, on the left is the front. The consequent differences, and you can see that the window is just turned upside down. Now, this is a device to deal with the fact that the levels of the building were completely different across not only the existing building, but the new buildings that we added had to provide access for car park, and so it had headroom issues, which were not the same, didn't meet the levels of the existing building. So this device of the ramp plus this treatment of the facade gave us continuity of the facade that relates to the historical facade, but at the same time, the level of the interior is able to be accommodated. So it's a very tolerant idea of a facade. On the interior, these are the existing spaces on the right-hand side, our work. We understood that the interior was a noble shell, and our first task was to reinstate a certain character that, let's say, the citizens of that Blankenberge might recognize from their memory of this very important, the main school building in the town. And it was organized by using the roof space for the non-fiction department. The fiction was on the first floor, ground floor was public reading rooms, and the basement was an auditorium and storage, with offices for the librarian here and a children's library in the other new building. You can see how we just reappropriated what was there. And you can also begin to see on the left-hand side that the idea of a library was always slightly secondary in our mind. The first step was to reinstate the kind of noble character, and the next job was to make it a library. But we always imagined that the library was a transient use. It was the reason for the competition, but we were making a building for 150 years. And I'm not sure if a library will be like a library is that we know in 150 years' time. So the only thing that's fixed is this piece of furniture here. The rest of the library is added in lightweight pieces. So in a way, it feels temporary. on the ground floor, this is the entrance space. And you, with a combination of light, filigree curtains, handwriting, that is a very low scale, in a very big building. When you sit in the window seat, you look to your right, and there's some words written, poetry from a local artist, a local poet. Just a small moment between you and the building, just a small moment. No one else knows you're there, that's it. There's a moment of intimacy within this kind of large project. The second project of that similar scale is a refurbishment of a very complex set of buildings to make an undergraduate business school in the East End of London. We call it Hult because this is the name of the owner of the school. Project really was about appreciating that everything is relevant. So on the left, that's the existing. So we have a listed brewery, a building that doesn't conform to the geometry of the road, of commercial road, a terrible tower building with apartments for students, and just as bad ground floor extension, making an office space with like trendy louvers. And then a little sign of the old gateway into the brewer's yard. A mess. And this on the right-hand side is what we saw when we arrived. So you have this combination of, in fact, on this floor, it's all new. So you have very high concrete frame. They did one thing that we're grateful to them for, because this was a commercial office project that never found a tenant, but they sold it to the school. But the strange thing they did was that they matched the floor levels of the brewery in their new frame. I mean, most developers I know would say, oh, can we get like an extra floor? But they didn't do that. And that, I'm happy that they didn't, because that gave us something to work with. And the space between the existing building and this new piece here was an atrium. And this was required by heritage to protect the brewery. It's like bad. And this is what, so, okay, what do? We had almost no money and we had to build it in 1 year. So the first thing that we did was that we made it what we call an inventory of rooms. Because as you moved around this building, if you don't judge it too much, you realized that whether they're very old rooms or very new, when you put them together, it's an amazing mix of spaces. And we made this inventory, which we presented in a scroll, 4.5 meter long scroll at the competition interview, and said, there's your school. It's already here. All you need to do is call each room a name, because it's all there, yeah? Apart from a few other things, of course. And we show this picture on the right because there's an incredible physicality of this from this building. There was a cast iron structure, timber floors, everything painted, over painted, so as in layer upon layer. And we said to ourselves, the school is there. We just need to allocate uses to the different rooms. But how do we intervene? How do we approach the idea of adding? Because it has to have furniture and classrooms. And we were inspired by the idea of carpentry, meaning that everything we placed in the building would be made of carpentry, sawn. And depending on the scale of the piece, the finish and the detail would be appropriate. Reminds me of these beautiful pews, the beautiful furniture that you see in paintings like the Salondem and others, that they're sort of insertions, they're installed, they're pieces that are installed in a big space. So our idea was to do exactly that, to clean mostly the existing, to add some basic services only to the classrooms, which had to be climatized. But then to add furniture, like on the right-hand side, this is a prototype for a corral where you make quiet study. The consequence was a sort of collage. And I must say, you could say bricolage. That's a very trendy thing to say. It was a few years ago anyway, bricolage. There's a consequence with working like this. You have to be relaxed about form and actually enjoy the idea that things just come together, and that merging, that conglomerateness has a certain quality. It actually takes a lot of thinking about too. But here you can see, just as we knew that in the brewery there were large pieces of furniture, like we call them tons, you know, the containers for beer and hops and water. And this is a building that was made for big pieces to be sitting inside it. So we added big pieces, rooms, studies, as a second scale after the scale of the building. We inherited everything. So they see on the floor, it's a raised floor from an office with no carpet, and we just used that. And you can see the relationship between on the right-hand side, what was the old office building and the brewery is sort of stuff. And we added paint. Indeed, you may look here. This is a painted floor. What we discovered is that by making a template and using floor masonry paint, a big expanse of a really bad floor of concrete, if you add this, you create a certain scale, and it is a certain kind of quality. You can see another one at the back there, which was an existing red floor. We didn't paint the red floor, it was there, but we added a black square template, and in this case, a concrete floor that we added this white template. The classrooms on the left were seen almost as buildings within the space, so they have elevations, windows. And on the right-hand side, the piece of carpentry that holds the whole project together, because the staircases were really hidden, is a new stair space. It's not just a staircase. The balconies are really broad. The wall of the stair is very high. So it's almost like you enter into a space and climb up the building. It connects all the floors that were never connected before. And guess where it is? It's in the atrium that the Heritage Department wanted so desperately to keep as a sort of vitrine, to keep you away from the fabric of the brewery. And we managed to convince them that they should do the opposite now and bring the students close up, face to face with the existing building. This light, this roof light, is an existing roof light that we lifted up by one story. It's all completely existing, but we just took it apart, lifted it up so that the stair could meet the top floor. This is a painting called The Fate of the Animals, and it's a really important picture. I actually don't like it particularly as a piece of art. It is that sort of period of German expressionism that just doesn't really, it leaves me a bit cold. It's just that the ideas of this painting are really important, I would say, to our attitude to transformation. It was a painting from 1913 by Franz Marc, who was really quite a well-known painter within that period. He was killed in the First World War. And in 1930, the year after he painted it, the same year he died, all his paintings were stored, and the warehouse in which they were stored caught fire. And almost all his work was destroyed. But The Fate of the Animals was badly damaged. Franz Merck's friend, nice to have this type of a friend, Paul Klee, who's of course a magnificent painter, offered to restore the painting, which he did meticulously. And you might begin to see on the right-hand side that he repainted absolutely, precisely the old painting. But then he did something very important. He added a brown wash to the work that he did. And in so doing, he completed the picture, but he also transformed it by adding his own narrative of the changes that took place since the painting's inception. Very beautiful. This is about adding a new layer set within a context of what is there or what is left, but also about adding a further narrative. And this painting was put on the table by Roger Dina because the last two projects are about a kind of shift in scale. I would say to you that in my own mind, those sort of earlier projects, it was possible to define a framework of ideas for restoration and transformation in quite a clear, conceptually clear, disciplined way. When the scale of the project changes, so too does the need to be more flexible, I would say. And these two are large projects. They're also civic, cultural buildings. And Roger Dina showed us that painting when we were working together on the Museum of London competition that we didn't win. So I'm showing you lots of things we didn't win. Anyway, just to tell you, of course, that a competition, there's always something to learn. But the Museum of London, which is a sort of rather, it's like a really touristy museum, but actually its collection is amazing. But they show almost none of the interesting bits. But they were under new directorship, and they decided to move from their position in the Barbican to, amazingly, Smithfield Market, which you can see in the middle of the picture. And that's a meat market from the as early as the 18th century. Cattle and sheep were brought, in fact, down this road, St. John Street, here, to the market where they were prepared to be eaten. Really interesting to see this view of London, because you see the medieval fabric. This was actually post-war. You can see on the left-hand side there's certain damage, but really interesting to see that Smithfield Market was built on the Roman grid of the city. Unlike the rest of the adjoining fabric, it stands sort of in defiance almost, but with almost, let's say, an abstract geometry. But the idea of the Museum of London was to move the museum into this part of the market with the intention of eventually extending to this part, and this would remain the meat market. It's on site now, by the way, just not by us. And the project composed the refurbishment of this building, the preparation for the extension of this, a new block of existing buildings with a new insertion, and then most interestingly, a subterranean context in which there was a heavy structure and, believe it or not, a train track. So the southwest train runs right through with no walls. I mean, it's just a train. And this was the site. Oh, yeah, sorry. I can't really see that picture very well, but the original immediate idea we had was to work on the idea of the cardo and decamanos, this sort of powerful geometry that the Roman building had in a way established, this linear axis with this cross axis, and make a new entrance street here that connected two streets together under an existing canopy that it was there already. And that from this position, there would be a route down to the basement. And here, the basement gallery, there'd be certain galleries with certain level of environmental control in the basement, which was more easy to control environmentally there. And this building took hold, was the research part of the building and the offices and things like that. But the main market, the idea was to present the space as found. So there was almost no environmental control, and it was a place for visiting exhibitions. On the left-hand side, you can see historical view of that space. And on the right-hand side, you can see our idea of emptying it of meat and replacing it with simple platforms, repairing and sometimes painting the existing fabric. It was about touching the building as lightly as it could possibly be. And underneath, there was a more kind of better environment condition, but the existing infrastructure of the city became the backdrop for the permanent exhibitions. Here you can see this extraordinary relationship of transport infrastructure, structural infrastructure, with the sort of set of civic spaces and this important link. So the visitors' walk that would eventually extend into the next building was part of the axis character. This is the entrance, the new street. There's an extraordinary brick wall on the left was just there. So we, with the amazing abutment to the Victorian building, we kept that. And a museum needs to be seen. And we knew that we needed to find a kind of, let's say, some sort of landmark gesture. Otherwise, we wouldn't win the competition. Big were against us. They didn't win either. But on the right-hand side, you can see a cupola, because the original meat market had a series of towers, you know, marking the building. And the one on the right had been destroyed. You can see only the top of it was taken away. So we replaced it with a mesh, a metal mesh with an installed LED assembly that would allow the building, allow signage to happen day and night. And indeed, because of the lighting, we could achieve a kind of kaleidoscope of movement and changes. So it became a kind of trace of what was there, but in the end, a kind of communication tool to spread to the broader aspects of the city. The final project I wanted to show is a current project, the Canal Centre Pompidou in Brussels. It was a project that we won in competition together with two other offices, NOAA, Architekten from Brussels, and EM2N from Zurich. There was an international competition in which all of the entries were teams of architects because the project was so big. And indeed, the construction of the project is a team of contractors, two contractors working together to build such a large project. The site is the former Citroën car factory, and we are tasked to provide 40,000 square meters of exhibition and cultural space. The client is the government of the region of Brussels, which we know as Fondation Canal. A separate entity was established to run the project. And when we won the competition, we established an entity of our own, a shared authorship entity called Atelier Canal, in which the three offices, or the partners of the three offices, became partners of Atelier Canal. We have an office on the site with 9 people working away on the project, which should be finished in 2025. I show it really to continue this point about how do you address transformation? You know, it's not possible to imagine a single answer to the problem. And instead it requires a set of strategies that reinforce, in our opinion, the attitude of the existing building. You know, this picture, in my mind, says a lot about the realities of reuse. To most people, we're reusing the existing building, but this is one of the spaces at the moment. Almost everything has to come off. And look at the extra structure, the infrastructure required just to hold the existing. You know, I show it because I think it's so important to have a kind of realistic idea of what reuse means. And I find the topic a really interesting and challenging one, but nowhere near critical enough in what it really means, particularly at schools of architecture, where there's a sort of romantic idea of keeping everything as it is. And particularly in a public building, you simply can't do that. Our mantra was to touch the building as lightly as possible, to trust what was there. And I'll explain how we had to face the reality of that in a minute. But at the heart of the project is this showroom. So Henri Citroën moved his car manufacturing to Brussels as its headquarters. He bought the whole of the city block, apart from one building, and the back of the building was the garage in which they put parts together, and the front of the building was this showroom where he would display the cars on a main thoroughfare into the center of the city. And over the years, as the road itself was lifted to create a highway, so too he added, or platforms were added within the showroom, basically to lift the view of the car up. So when the road came up, you could see the car at your eye level. And we are reimagining this space as we might describe a stage for Brussels. It's a public room with no program, but at the back of the space, a series of shelf platforms allow for the provision of a restaurant, a flexible space, a few things like that sit at the back and in a way create a covered entrance into the building from this side. But the showroom itself has guillotine windows that were, in fact, a version of that existed in the existing building, but we are able to elevate at the ground level the whole perimeter of the building, so that in certain times of the day or night, this public room becomes an extension of the city pavements. At the very heart of this is another fiction, a delusion. This picture on the left-hand side that looks like an aerial photograph is actually a dream. It's actually what Henri Citroën and his architect really wanted to happen, which was to make a glass palace of the 1930s, which was ultra modern. You can see the strong horizontal showroom on the left. All the workshops are hidden behind this beautiful glazing. In truth, there's a building here that he couldn't buy. And you know who owned it? Michelin. Michelin refused to sell it to Citroën. I love that. They're meant to be friends because they both rely on each other, but no friendship there. But, you know, this was a vision of what they really wanted this building to be. And the reality was this. There's the building. And they kind of had to piece their dream around reality. I say this because when you're working on a transformation project, the more you dig into it, the layers, the more you realize just how much is invented. And where do you place yourself when you're making your moment, you know, your work in the history of a building? We found it really, really interesting because at what point do we register in the life of the building? You know, it was a heroic place in the 30s. It became a headquarters for the Nazis in the war. It was a helipad, a place for the helicopters at one point. It was various types of garage in its life. It had a very varied life. So what's relevant? What do you do? Anna Wiebruck, the great set designer, German set designer, who worked with us as one of our critical friends. We invited a series of wonderful, interesting, intelligent people to join us at the competition stage, like provide a critique to the work we were making. Visited the building, very modest person, but amazing set designer. And she came out and we recorded this. I like the poems of John Hedghook very much. And in his book, such places as memory, there is one specific sentence that came to my mind after visiting the Citroën building. The house never forgets the sound of its original occupants. It was a very powerful moment when we heard that. A reminder that it's not just fabric that you're dealing with, but you're dealing with memory and you're dealing with the sense of the past. The feeling that once a certain activity has happened in a building, it's not sort of forgotten. It's there. It's in the roots. It's in the under the skin of the building. We found that really powerful for us, and therefore the idea that this was a car garage remains very much in our minds when we're working on this complete transformation of use into a cultural centre and a new public space. But in terms of this idea of attitudes to transformation, the building was so large and complex that we had to, let's say, employ all those different ideas that I ran through earlier on in the lecture, from Ruskin, Viollet-le-Duc, even maybe the Venice Charter, but certainly ideas of Dolgast and others that were specific responses to a very set of specific issues that the building had. And they are first of all, of course, our instinct was we want to keep as much as we can. We'd like to go back to certain original intentions, but what they were, we had to define. We weren't really interested in the historical value of the building, but more in the experiential value of the building, knowing that its origin was in a way a kind of dream. So the horizontal fascia that you can see running around the existing building, added by us, reinforced by us, signified its identity, its charisma, and we extended it to enfold the complete museum with an information-rich and curatable interactive ribbon. You see it's running here, which is where the existing workshop is, but you see it continues going in this direction. Indeed, it goes across what used to be a building. Because not only did we, let's say, reinforce the horizontal idea of the building with adding a new strip, but we also rebuilt, reconstructed an imagined piece of the building. Because, as I said, this wasn't the glazing of the Citroën building. It was another building that Citroën owned, but he didn't finally complete the whole project. So we dismantled that building. It was actually where our first office was, and reconstructed the glazing. Of course, it's not quite the same, but it's almost a reconstruction, and then allowed the ribbon to extend. So there's reconstruction, there's the creative restoration. There are, of course, interventions that have got nothing to do with the past, like in 3 places, adjusting taking the existing glazing out and replacing it with very large openings, sliding windows, so that large art pieces can be brought into the first floor directly from the street. And of course, fill it with ventilation and fill it with a visibility of the interior on certain occasions. So that's completely like, cutting in, adding in a very direct way. Detailing of the sliding elements have got nothing to do with the old 1930s glazing. But secretly and somehow the cross bracing has something to do with canal. That's when you're meant to laugh. Okay. Here you can see the existing car ramps that go up to the ground floor become the main circulation idea for the public. The showroom was on the right-hand side. These are in front of you. You see in the very middle is a street that crosses the nave at an axis. So the existing organization of the building we reinforced to become the main orientation. That gives us 4 entrances, even though 2 are the obvious ones to use now, But actually, we pretty much believe that within a few years, the other one on the left-hand side is going to become really important because there's a big development going on that's at the moment just a building site. So we're anticipating a future, but reinforcing the existing spatial and orientation structure. As I said, our starting point was to trust what was there and to touch the building lightly. And when we first started working on the project, we got access to a certain type of photography in which you photograph the floor, the ground, which we could then piece together. And this is the piano nobile, the first floor that was added in the 50s as a raised platform, which we liked to keep because it brought you close to the roof. And you can see the markings for parking and the different layers of paint, all done in an improvised way to reinforce somehow, give coherence to the different roles of the car park itself, of the building itself. And our intention was to keep this paint as a sort of trace of the past, just as it was to keep the patina in a Ruskin type way, to keep the patina of the existing roof, where our intention was literally just to brush the dirt off and leave it. The problem is that as a public building, the paint needed to be tested for toxicity. And when it was tested, it was seen to have chrome 6, not only in the steelwork, but in the floor as well. This is a toxic form of chromium, a carcinogenic substance that can cause severe health problems. So all the paint that existed in the building had that was meant to be for corrosion protection was toxic. This really affected our concept of not touching the building. The client would never accept leaving it because they would then open a public building that had toxic surfaces. And so we had to accept that it needed to be stripped. So all the patina of the building had to be taken away. The right-hand side is the consequence of that. The cleaning that was very expensive to do because it has to be done in plastic containers, because it's so toxic. And then there was a prime paint. So don't worry about the color, but the fact is suddenly from the left-hand side, the most amazing, powerful sense when you visit this building of the structure of little pieces made together and each having this subtle color we had to reimagine the project as something that was potentially more unified. And in a way, it's that little micro layer that gives an existing building character. When you take it away, what happens to the building? If you're a romantic like I am, it's very upsetting. But I suppose if you're, not that interested in emotions and are interested only in efficiency and tools and then it doesn't really matter. But it mattered to me and us. So what do? We always envisaged the building. This is on the left-hand side as a perspective, on the right-hand side is a photograph. We always presented the building as something that was only slightly modified from what existed already. You can see on the left the road markings in the foreground, for example, and the existing different colors of paint on the roof that were made like that to reinforce the use of the old garage were just left. So the other thing is that this unique project allowed was that when we won the competition, the building was then open to the public for 19 months for a project that they called Canal Brut, which was basically a set of exhibitions, usually using work from the collections of the Pompidou, because there was a sort of collaboration that exists for a couple more years between the Canal and the Pompidou, that allowed Canal to open and to, let's say, use the building and use the opening as a test bed. What's it like if the building is open 24 hours a day? What's it like in the summer? we have to give a bottle of water to everybody who comes in the room. What's it, or in the building? What's it like in the winter? We have to give a blanket to everybody who enters the building. And a set of very exciting exhibitions happened, and we learned a lot, as did our client. So there's a sort of learning process, you know, always challenging, let's say, one's initial presumptions of what could be. And alongside that was our insistence on looking very, very carefully at what was there. And we then established a collaboration with an artist, Sarah Smulders, to help us develop the color concept. Became even more important once we realized we were losing the color of from the existing buildings. And Sarah, who's a forensic artist, you know, obsessed, I'd say, made an extraordinary document of every element of the building with our help, including establishing every color that was used from the 30s right through to the current day. And in her studies, she began to establish that there were certain datums that the paint of the existing building had established. And it wasn't through art that these were established, it was through necessity, that an area needed to be defined for the parking of a certain car that was being fixed, you know, set of cars. And a workman was told, can you just go and paint that area, please? Oh, here's a pot of paint that we got from the store. And Sarah began to notice that the height of that paint related to the height of a man or a person, anyway, and of a brush mark. And where the columns were close to a step, the level of the paint went up because you could step up and get that level there. And she began to observe that actually there was a kind of, first of all, there was a datum, but that datum adjusted in a specific way. And it was related to the movement of paint, the movement of the arm, very human aspect. And these observations have evolved into a manual for how to repaint the building. Here are some early studies in which we are employing only the colors that have existed in the life of the building, but reimagined in a way and reorganized with certain different emphasis. But still there is this existing idea of a horizon that emerged from an observation of what was there. So there's going to be a brand new paint scheme for the project, but the scheme itself has come out of an understanding of how the coloring of the building has emerged over time. Alongside the restoration and transformation, there was always intervention also, because, you know, how do you make a world-class museum out of an old garage, you know, that has no thermal qualities? Well, if you want to do it in an efficient way, you maybe concentrate the parts of the new building that need a lot of energy. And that's exactly what we did. 3 houses, basically 3 buildings, are inserted into the garage structure. Here you can see just the pile layouts, actually, with the basements of the 3 volumes that we add. Top right is the Museum of Modern Art. Bottom right is the Museum of Architecture. And on the left-hand side is what we call the Rassembleur, a kind of collection of cultural functions, including an auditorium and also the offices of the Fondation Canal. It's an idea that, of course, has much precedent. This is the most wonderful building, maybe one of my most buildings I'm most interested in, the Great Mosque in Cordoba, that was built over many generations in parts, and indeed was victim of various invasions and different cultural, let's say, overlaps and interventions, including the building of a cathedral, a Western cathedral in the middle of a mosque. Somehow it works. You know, this is a landscape of columns and an arched landscape. By the way, the arches, the column heads are all borrowed from the Roman city in Cordoba. There's almost everything, certainly in the first phase of the the mosque building are borrowed pieces from another set of buildings, Roman. So we have the horizontality of the mosque, and then this the verticality of the Christian church that relies on top light, because in Christianity, God's up there, but in Islam, well, God's in here, and in fact, you need to feel that you're part of the earth. That was a bit of an aside, just to talk about Cordoba. I don't really know why I mentioned it, but just to say, if you don't know that building, go and look at it. Here are the sections. You can see the installed volumes that sink into the ground. On the right-hand side is the Museum of Modern Art with a 5.5 meter high basement gallery with no daylight. So it's an interior space. And then a construction of gallery floors, all of which are slightly different. And on the bottom, you can see from a distance how these volumes emerge out of the roof of the existing garages themselves. The interior elevations of these volumes are in the most simple clay brick, a brick that's glued together so it doesn't have thick joints. On the right-hand side, you can see that brick. It's used in a standard way to build partitions in housing projects. But the consequence is you have this very beautiful reeded finish, and it's just whitewashed, because these walls will be curated. They'll be changed. They'll need to be repainted. They'll be, they're not part of, let's say, architecture. They're part of the curatorial policy. In certain cases, they're stretched apart, you can see on the right, to allow for acoustic absorption. So they sit as structures within a bigger structure. They create a kind of backdrop to the existing steel frame. The new volume, this is the Museum of Modern Art, which has, as I say, a basement and four floors, the ground and the first floor attached to the existing structure. And each gallery has a different floor finish and a slightly different attitude to finish, but pretty much the same servicing strategy, which integrates structure and ventilation and cooling together. The idea was that in this building, we would offer a great variety of rooms. The flexibility came from that choice of a broad choice of spaces. I think that it's important, it's impossible to avoid within the transformation debate energy. And I don't mean just like, let's save it, but in a museum situation, there is a kind of astounding requirement to control the temperature of an interior space. I think museums of all architectural typologies are the most expensive for energy use, because they have to, for example, in this case, or like the Pompidou, the main gallery has to meet 20 degrees plus or minus 1 degree. That requires a lot of kit. So on top of the Museum of Modern Art, there's the view of the plant. And on the top, above that, the risers are absolutely crammed full of ducts. And I find that at the moment, and there's no sign of this changing, museums that have beautiful works of Vermeer and everything, and the Mona Lisa, require this type of control system to be able to display work. Only when museums and curators accept that they need to drop the standards are museums ever going to be a kind of environmentally responsive project. Anyway, the volumes arise through the roof, and this is a mock-up of the facade of one of the three volumes, which has a loose, sort of aerated cladding of galvanized steel and ribbed glass panels. It's a building that's made out of small pieces, just like the existing roof. But the three volumes become, of course, a kind of important landmark within the backdrop of the actual financial part of the city that's beyond it. So reuse, it's not just useful, it's necessarily sustainability-wise, but it needs to be engaged with by all of us as architects, with cultural ideas. And our position is on the continuous line between the past and the present, looking for other meanings of originality and authenticity to go beyond pure materiality of the built relic, and also focus on other immaterial values and meanings that encourage a more experimental and experiential way of weaving the past and the present together. I can't help feel that this isn't so dissimilar to the way that old buildings were treated until the end of the 19th century. I feel we have to be ready to abandon the narrow material definition of the notion of authenticity that prevails in the field of monument preservation as defined by the Venice Charter. We're not looking for what is closest to the original, whatever that means. The unique moment when a building arose, the way it was once conceived, but instead we're aiming to make history visible through a clearly selected lens. The less attractive and the beautiful, the agony and the celebratory, the glory and the decline, the material traces of centuries of alterations, demolition, renewal. It's also okay to be nostalgic in a certain kind of way. And therefore, instead of one single truth, the narrative expands to several storylines at the same time. For this to happen, and for any of us to work creatively within the transformation and reuse debate, building codes need to catch up with our ideas, and we have to address the challenge of thermal requirements. Merci de votre attention.